The sky above the desolate country road was bruised, a violent swirl of purple and grey that promised a storm. Driving her rattling 20-year-old sedan, Elena felt a similar storm brewing inside her own heart. The exhaustion from a grueling double shift pressed down on her, a physical weight on her shoulders, but it was nothing compared to the crushing anxiety of the eviction notice tucked in her purse. Its sharp edges felt like a constant, nagging reminder of her failure. The air, thick with the smell of damp earth and imminent rain, offered no comfort. Every mile marker that passed was another tick of a clock, counting down to homelessness for her and her son. The world felt vast and empty, a lonely stage for her private struggle, and she was so very tired of playing her part. Suddenly, the car's engine, a faithful companion in her daily battle, began to sputter and whine, its protest echoing her own weariness. With a final, shuddering cough, it died. Elena coasted to the side of the road, the silence that followed roaring in her ears. The rhythmic blinking of the hazard lights was the only sign of life for miles. She rested her forehead against the cool, worn plastic of the steering wheel, closing her eyes for just a moment. It was always one more thing, one more broken part, one more unexpected bill, one more obstacle standing between her and a single night of peaceful sleep. The first drop of rain hit the windshield, a solitary splat that seemed to mock her powerlessness against the coming deluge. As she lifted her head, ready to face this new crisis, her headlights sliced through the deepening dusk and caught something on the shoulder of the road. It was a misshapen heap, a pile of what looked like discarded rags. But as she squinted, a horrifying recognition dawned. It was the shape of a man. A cold dread, sharp and immediate, seized her. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed for her to lock the doors, to try the engine again, to flee. She thought of her son waiting for her at home, safe and unaware. Getting involved was a risk she couldn't afford. Yet, a deeper, more insistent voice, the quiet whisper of her conscience, urged her to open the door and step out into the encroaching darkness. Her worn-out sneakers sank into the soft, muddy earth as she approached, her phone's flashlight cutting a nervous, trembling beam through the gloom. The man was a wreck of a human being, his face swollen and battered beyond recognition. His clothes, however, were a stark contradiction. Even torn and caked in mud, the fabric was clearly expensive. A tailored suit that spoke of a life of boardrooms and immense wealth, a world utterly alien to this forgotten ditch. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and ragged. As a part-time caregiver, Elena's training took over, pushing aside her fear. She felt for a pulse at his neck. It was there, a faint, thready flutter of life. For a fleeting second, his eyes opened, revealing not pain but a profound and absolute terror. In that moment, the choice was no longer a choice. The eviction notice, the empty gas tank, the gnawing hunger, it all vanished, replaced by the undeniable reality of the broken man at her feet. This was not a problem to be avoided, but a life to be saved. Her empathy, a quality that the world had so often mistaken for weakness, surged through her, becoming an unbreakable resolve. As she began the arduous task of dragging the stranger's dead weight toward her car, the heavens finally opened up, unleashing a torrential downpour that soaked her to the bone. She didn't know his name or the story behind his brutal condition, but as she shielded him from the rain, she was completely unaware that she had just welcomed the very architect of her misery into her life. With the man's heavy, unconscious form slumped in her passenger seat, Elena's hands trembled as she turned the key in the ignition. The engine gave a pathetic, gurgling click, then fell silent. She tried again, and again, her desperation growing with each failed attempt. The rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers only smeared the torrential rain, distorting the world outside into a watery, unforgiving blur. The car was well and truly dead. She was stranded, miles from home, with a broken-down vehicle, no money for a tow truck, and a critically injured stranger whose very presence felt like a monumental risk. The weight of her choice settled upon her, as heavy and cold as the rain soaking through the car's rusted frame. Every second that passed was another second her son Leo was waiting for her, alone in their small apartment. A frantic voice in her head screamed at the absurdity of it all. Her son was waiting, the rent was overdue, and she was here on a forgotten road, with a man who could be a danger, a criminal, a ghost. The smart thing to do, the sane thing, was to get out, walk away. And find a phone to call the authorities. Let them handle it. It wasn't her problem. She had enough of her own. She glanced at the crumpled eviction notice in her purse, its stark black letters a testament to her own precarious existence. Helping him could be the final straw that broke her already fragile life. She couldn't afford this detour, this complication, this act of foolish compassion. The world had taught her, time and again, that looking out for yourself was the only way to survive. Yet, as she looked at him, she saw none of the menace her fear had conjured. She saw only profound, devastating vulnerability. His breathing was a shallow, ragged whisper in the suffocating silence of the car. A trickle of blood, diluted by the rain, traced a path from his temple down his mud-caked cheek. It was the sight of his hand, lying limp on the seat between them, that broke through her panic. The fingers were long and elegant, but the knuckles were scraped raw, a sign of a struggle, of a life violently interrupted. She knew, with a certainty that defied all logic and self-preservation, that she would pay a steep price for this decision. But the thought of leaving him here to be found or not found was a heavier burden than any consequence she could imagine. Summoning a reserve of strength she didn't know she possessed, Eleanor made her decision. She couldn't drive him home, so she would have to carry him. The miles back to her small apartment complex felt like an impossible pilgrimage. Hoisting his arm over her shoulder, she half-dragged, half-carried his dead weight along the muddy shoulder of the road. The rain was a merciless, blinding sheet, plastering her thin jacket to her skin and turning the ground into a treacherous mire. Each step was a battle against the sucking mud, the burning in her muscles, and the chilling wind that whipped around them. The man's occasional pain-filled groan was the only sound that pierced the roar of the storm, a constant, harrowing reminder of the life she now held in her hands. Finally, she stumbled through her own doorway, the scent of rain and desperation clinging to them both. The small apartment, with its worn furniture and the faint, comforting smell of Leo's crayon drawings, felt like a sanctuary from another world. She managed to lower the stranger onto her threadbare couch, the only piece of furniture that wasn't a strict necessity. He lay there, a broken and muddy effigy of wealth and power, completely helpless in the heart of her poverty. As she stood over him, catching her breath, her body aching with exhaustion, a profound silence fell over the room. The storm raged on outside, but she knew, with a chilling sense of finality, that she had just brought the real tempest inside. Her life, as she knew it, was over. The first light of dawn filtered through the apartment's single, grimy window, casting long, dusty shadows across the floor. The stranger was awake. His eyes, swollen slits of a startlingly clear blue, darted around the unfamiliar room, filled with a primal, one-cornered animal fear. He tried to move, to speak, but his body was a prison, his throat a knot of useless muscle. Elena, having spent the night in a chair beside him, approached with a calm that belied the frantic terror in her own heart. She gently bathed his battered face with a warm, damp cloth, her touch as practiced and steady, as if she had done this 1,000 times before. Her son, Leo, stood silently in the doorway, a small, wide-eyed sentinel clutching a worn superhero figurine, his childhood world now containing a real, broken man. The scent of antiseptic mingled with the smell of brewing coffee, creating a strange, domestic tableau of crisis and care. Days bled into a week, each one a delicate, unspoken negotiation of trust and vulnerability. The man, whom Elena had quietly named John in her mind for lack of a better word, remained a silent observer from the couch. He couldn't speak, but his gaze became a language of its own. It followed Elena as she moved through her cramped living space, a mixture of profound gratitude, deep-seated shame, and a haunting bewilderment she couldn't begin to understand. She fell into a grueling rhythm: work, care for Leo, and tend to John. She would spoon-feed him watered-down soup, her own stomach grumbling in protest. She sacrificed her own meager portions, telling herself it was more important for him to regain his strength. This quiet, relentless giving became a ritual, a prayer whispered not in a church, but in the humble, selfless act of keeping a stranger alive. The heavy silence of the apartment was finally broken, not by the man, but by the innocent, persistent chatter of her son. Leo, his initial fear replaced by a child's pure curiosity, slowly began to include the silent figure on the couch in his world. He would line up his plastic dinosaurs on the floor, narrating their epic battles for his captive audience. One afternoon, he carefully placed one of his favorite crayon drawings, a wobbly but bright yellow sun, on the man's chest. "This is so you don't feel the dark," Leo explained with solemn finality. Elena, watching from the kitchen, saw the man's composure finally crack. A single, silent tear traced a clean path through the grime on his cheek. It was the first sign of the person trapped inside the broken shell, and it solidified Elena's resolve in a way that no logical argument ever could. One evening, as the city lights began to twinkle outside, a small miracle occurred. The man managed to weakly flex the fingers of his right hand. To Elena, it felt like a monumental victory. After tucking Leo into bed, she sat on the floor by the couch, the room lit only by a small, tart, flickering lamp. She spoke to him in a low, soothing voice, telling him about her day, the funny way a customer had tried to pay with a coupon that expired a decade ago. As she talked, her eyes fell upon a thin, silvery scar just above his temple, almost hidden by his hair. It was old, clearly from a wound suffered long before the recent, brutal assault. It was a mark of a different trauma, a silent testament to a past filled with a pain she couldn't imagine, deepening the mystery of who he was. The pile of unopened, red-stamped envelopes on her kitchen counter grew taller, a silent, menacing tower of her impending doom. Yet, inside the apartment, a fragile warmth had taken root. One night, while changing the man's bandages, Elena recounted a memory of her own father, a story of kindness and laughter that made her own eyes well up. When she finished, she looked at him, and for the first time, his gaze was not one of confusion or pain, but of intense, piercing focus. His lips, chapped and bruised, parted. He struggled, a guttural sound forming in his throat, his entire body tensing with the effort. Finally, a single raspy word tore through the quiet room, raw and full of a lifetime of questions. Why? It hung in the air between them, a question not about the bandages or the soup, but about the very nature of her compassion. A grace he clearly never expected and could not comprehend. The single word, a shard of glass in the quiet room, left Elena momentarily speechless. How could she explain a choice that felt less like a thought and more like a reflex of the soul? She looked from his searching, desperate eyes to the small, crayon-drawn sun that still rested on a nearby table, a silent testament to her son's simple faith in light. She tried to articulate the feeling, the ingrained belief that you don't leave someone broken on the side of the road, no matter the cost. She spoke of her own loneliness, of the countless times a small kindness from a stranger had been the only thing that kept her from shattering. Her explanation wasn't a grand philosophy, but a humble confession. She helped him because, in his helplessness, she saw a reflection of every person who has ever needed a hand and not received one. She saw herself, his face, a canvas of old and new bruises, contorted with an emotion she couldn't decipher. It wasn't relief or gratitude, but something far more complex, like the cracking of a dam that had held back a lifetime of grief. His hand, shaking with a tremor that seemed to originate from his very core, slowly lifted and pointed to the faint, silvery scar above his temple. His voice, when it came again, was a ragged whisper, each word a monumental effort. He spoke of another night, another storm, another roadside. The words were disjointed, broken fragments of a memory he had tried to bury for years. He wasn't just a man who had been beaten. He was a man who had been haunted long before a single fist had struck him, and the ghost was finally demanding to be seen. The narrator's voice could paint the scene his broken words could not. A sleek, expensive car cutting through a rain-slicked highway years ago, the warm glow of the dashboard lights illuminating the face of a beautiful woman in the passenger seat, her laughter like music. In the back, a little girl with his same clear blue eyes, singing a nursery rhyme slightly off-key. He remembered the feeling of absolute, unshakable contentment, a life so perfect it felt like a dream. Then, the blinding glare of headlights swerving into their lane, the horrifying screech of metal on metal, and the world dissolving into a vortex of shattering glass and sudden, deafening silence. The scar on his temple was not from this recent attack. It was a permanent souvenir from the night his entire world was ripped away from him. He was the sole survivor. The man who awoke in a sterile hospital room was not the same one who had been driving that car. That man, the husband and father, had died in the wreckage alongside his family. What was left was a hollow shell, a ghost walking through the motions of life, fueled by a cold, relentless ambition that served only to distract him from the gaping wound in his soul. He had built an empire of steel and glass as a fortress around his broken heart, believing that if he controlled everything on the outside, he could numb the unbearable emptiness on the inside. Listening to his fractured story, Elena's heart didn't just break for him, it recognized him. She saw past the mystery and the expensive, ruined suit, and saw only a man drowning in a sorrow so deep it had reshaped his entire being. In that moment, she was no longer a caregiver, and he was no longer a patient. They were simply two survivors, their separate tragedies converging in the dim light of her impoverished living room. She reached out and took his trembling hand, her grip firm and steady, a silent promise that he was no longer alone in his darkness. She had offered him soup and bandages, but now she was offering him something far more vital, grace. She had accepted his darkest secret, seeing the wounded human beneath the layers of pain and loss. He closed his eyes, feeling the first flicker of warmth he'd known in years, a fragile peace settling in his chest. But what he didn't know as he held the hand of his selfless savior was that the eviction notice on her counter bore the name of his company, and that fate was about to settle the score. The fragile peace that had settled in the small apartment was shattered by a sharp, authoritative knock on the door. It was a sound that didn't belong, a sound from the outside world of deadlines and demands, a world they had been hiding from. Eleanor froze, a half-peeled potato in her hand, her heart instantly leaping into her throat. It was too early for the landlord, and the sound was too confident for a neighbor. Leo looked up from his coloring book, his eyes wide with question. Hesitantly, Elena moved to the door, peering through the scratched peephole. She saw two figures, a woman in a perfectly tailored business suit holding a tablet, and a large man in a dark coat standing behind her. They looked official, expensive, and utterly out of place, like figures from a different reality who had taken a wrong turn and ended up on her doorstep. With trembling hands, she unlatched the deadbolt and opened the door a crack. The woman's gaze swept past Eleanor, her professionally polite expression melting into one of pure, unadulterated shock as her eyes landed on the couch. "Mr. Thorne," she breathed, pushing the door open wider and striding into the room as if she owned it. "Marcus, my God, we've been searching everywhere." The name, Marcus Thorne, hung in the air, foreign and heavy. The man on the couch flinched, his eyes closing for a brief second as if against a physical blow. The woman, his assistant Anne it seemed, was a whirlwind of frantic energy, her voice sharp and clear as she rattled off details about a police investigation, a corporate crisis, and a board of directors in panic. Elena just stood there, a silent, invisible ghost in her own home, the cold draft from the hallway chilling her to the bone. The assistant continued her rapid-fire report, gesturing with her tablet. "Because the Westwood development project has been stalled for weeks without your final signature. The demolition permits are about to expire, Mr. Thorne." At the mention of Westwood development, Elena's blood ran cold. The name was a brand on her soul, the faceless entity printed in bold Epriges black ink on the stack of red-stamped eviction notices on her counter. Her head snapped toward the man on the couch, the man she had called John, the man whose wounds she had cleaned and whose life she had painstakingly pieced back together. Marcus Thorne. The name was no longer just a name, it was a verdict. It was the architect of her misery, the phantom landlord who had haunted her sleepless nights, made flesh and blood on her threadbare sofa. The world tilted on its axis, the sounds of the room fading into a dull, distant roar. Elena saw everything as if through a distorted lens of water, the face of the man she had cared for, the vulnerability she had seen in his eyes, the fragile bond they had formed. It all curdled into a grotesque lie. Every meal she had shared, every dollar she had spent on medicine instead of groceries, every whispered word of encouragement now felt like a cruel act of self-sabotage. She had opened her home and her heart to the very person who was trying to rip that home away from her and Leo. The irony was a physical sickness, a bitter acid rising in her throat. She had been tending to the wolf while he was merely sharpening his teeth to devour her. Marcus struggled to push himself up, his face a mask of dawning horror as he watched the realization shatter across Elena's features. He understood. He finally understood the cosmic, cruel nature of their meeting. "Elena," he rasped, his voice cracking with a desperation that was terrifyingly real. He reached a trembling hand out to her, a plea for a connection that had just been irrevocably severed, but she flinched back as if his touch were fire, her eyes wide with a mixture of betrayal and profound shock. The man she had saved from the darkness was the source of it. The stranger she had shown mercy to was the one who had shown her none. In that silent, catastrophic moment, her entire world, built on a foundation of empathy, crumbled into dust. A wall of ice instantly formed around Elena's heart. So cold and absolute it stole the air from her lungs. The warmth, the empathy, the fragile connection she had nurtured for weeks, all of it shattered into a million glittering shards of foolishness. She saw not the broken man on her couch, but the faceless corporation that had been methodically dismantling her life, one threatening letter at a time. Every act of kindness now felt like a deep and personal humiliation. The soup she had given him might as well have been poison she fed to herself. She took a step back, a small, involuntary movement, but it was enough to create a chasm between them that felt miles wide. Her gaze, which had always held a soft, maternal concern, was now as hard and unforgiving as the concrete of the buildings his company sought to erect upon the ruins of her home. Marcus watched the light go out in her eyes, and the sight was more painful than any physical blow he had endured. He saw the precise moment, her compassion curdled into contempt. "Elena, please," he managed to say, his voice a raw, desperate rasp that was lost in the sterile efficiency of his assistant's presence. The woman was already on her phone, arranging for a private ambulance, speaking in hushed, urgent tones about security protocols and press blackouts. Her words were a foreign language, describing a world of power and consequence that made Elena's small apartment feel like a stage for a cruel cosmic joke. Elena felt her own poverty not as a circumstance, but as a character flaw. He must have been secretly mocking the entire time. Her pride, the only thing she had left, was a raw, gaping wound. Without another word, Elena turned her back on him. The rejection was not loud or violent. It was a quiet, devastating act of erasure. She walked to the small window overlooking the alley, wrapping her arms around herself as if to hold her splintering world together. The sight of a stray cat picking through a discarded takeout container felt more real, more honest than the man she had saved. She focused on the cracked pavement, the graffiti on the brick wall, anything to avoid looking at the source of her profound betrayal. She had shared her son's home, her last scraps of food, her deepest reserves of hope with her own executioner. The injustice of it was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it impossible to breathe. She was no longer his savior. She was just another obstacle to be managed and removed. The narrator could feel the crushing weight of her regret. She had protected him, not just from the elements, but from the world that had broken him. She had invited this darkness into the one place her son felt safe, believing she was acting out of a noble instinct. Now that instinct felt like a profound and unforgivable naivety. How could she have been so blind? Every gentle touch, every whispered story, every sacrifice now seemed like an act of treason against herself and her child. She had looked at a wolf, battered and bleeding, and had seen only a creature in need of comfort, forgetting that wolves, once healed, still have teeth. The silence in the room was deafening, filled with the unspoken accusation that her greatest virtue, her empathy, was also her most catastrophic weakness. His assistant finally fell silent, sensing the monumental, invisible battle being waged in the room. Marcus gathered every ounce of strength he possessed, his voice cutting through the tense air, stronger now, laced with an authority he had not used in weeks. "Leave us," he commanded the woman, not looking at her, his gaze fixed on Elena's rigid back. The assistant hesitated, then quietly gathered her things and slipped out the door, closing it with a soft click that echoed like a gunshot. They were alone again, just as they had been for weeks, but the space between them was now an impassable wasteland of secrets and pain. "Elena," he said again, his voice cracking with the weight of his unpardonable identity. She remained perfectly still, a silhouette against the graying light, leaving him and the audience to wonder if she would ever turn around. For a long time, the only sound in the room was the quiet ticking of a clock on the wall, each second marking an eternity of betrayal. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice a low, broken thing, stripped of all authority and filled only with a ragged shame. He didn't try to make excuses or defend his actions. Instead, he confessed the truth of his hollow existence since the accident that claimed his family. He explained how he had poured all his grief and rage into his work, building an empire of steel and glass as a fortress around his shattered heart. He hadn't seen buildings filled with homes. He had only seen numbers on a ledger, empty structures to be torn down and rebuilt in his own cold, empty image. He admitted that living in her home, witnessing her selfless care for her son, was the first time in years he had felt the warmth of a life he thought was lost to him forever, making his identity as her tormentor an unbearable, soul-crushing revelation. Elena slowly turned from the window, her face a pale, tear-streaked mask of profound sorrow. The ice in her eyes had not melted, but it was now fractured with pain. "Do you know what it's like?" she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. "To have to choose between buying medicine or milk, to lie awake every night listening for the sound of your son breathing, terrified that the next morning you'll have to tell him you've lost his home. Those red envelopes on my counter weren't just notices, Mr. Thorne. They were a countdown to the end of my world. Every day a piece of my hope was demolished by your company, by you. And all that time, I was here, giving you the food from my own plate, praying for you to heal, while you were the very sickness that was killing me." Her words struck him with more force than any physical blow. He didn't flinch away, but absorbed every ounce of her righteous pain, letting it dismantle the last vestiges of the unfeeling tycoon he used to be. Tears streamed freely down his bruised cheeks, not of self-pity, but of a genuine, agonizing remorse. "I didn't see," he choked out, the admission tearing from his soul. "I refused to see. In my own darkness, I tried to extinguish every light I encountered because I couldn't bear its warmth. Your home, your kindness to Leo. It was everything I had lost, and I was trying to destroy it without even knowing. You didn't just save my life, Elena. You forced me to look at the monster I had become." He finally understood that his vast fortune had only deepened his poverty of spirit, a poverty far more desperate than any she had ever known. Elena watched the complete and utter shattering of his pride. She saw not the powerful CEO, but the broken man from the roadside, finally confronting the wreckage of his own making. Her profound empathy, the very trait that had led her into this impossible situation, began to war with her sense of betrayal. She walked over to the counter and picked up the topmost eviction notice, its stark, official lettering feeling alien in her hand. She looked from the paper to the weeping man on her couch. The anger and hurt were still there, but beneath them, a deeper truth surfaced. This was not about forgetting the wrong he had done, but about choosing to see the man who was desperate to make it right. In a quiet act of grace, she slowly tore the notice in half, the sound of ripping paper a final, definitive end to his old life and the beginning of a new one for them both. A profound calm settled over Marcus, his tears subsiding into a look of clear, unwavering resolve. The man haunted by ghosts was gone, replaced by someone who had found a purpose beyond profit and loss. "May I use your phone?" he asked, his voice steady for the first time. Elena nodded, handing it to him. He dialed a number from memory, his gaze never leaving hers. "It's me," he said into the phone, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Cancel the Westwood demolition project, effective immediately. All eviction proceedings are to be terminated. Start a new initiative, the Westwood Restoration Project. We are renovating every unit, and you will find a way to transfer the title for apartment 3B to Elena Rivera, free and clear. I don't care how you do it. Just do it." He ended the call, the silence that followed filled not with tension, but with the fragile, hopeful light of a new dawn. 6 months later, the morning sun, no longer a pale, distant observer, now poured generously through the clean window pane, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, golden promises. The scent of fresh coffee and pancakes filled the small apartment, their apartment, a domestic perfume that had replaced the lingering smell of antiseptic and fear. Marcus, no longer a broken figure confined to the couch, sat at the small kitchen table, his movements still careful but imbued with a newfound purpose. He was helping Leo meticulously build a tower of colorful blocks, his deep voice a gentle rumble, as he offered strategic advice. Elena watched them from the stove, a soft, genuine smile gracing her lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. The storm had passed, and in its wake, it had not left wreckage, but had instead washed the world clean, revealing the foundations of a family she never knew she was building. The man who once commanded boardrooms with an iron will now found his greatest challenge in keeping a block tower from toppling over. The crisp, tailored suits had been replaced by a simple, comfortable sweater that fit him perfectly, a quiet symbol of his new life. He had spent years constructing an empire of cold steel and reflective glass, a monument to his own isolation, believing that power could insulate him from pain. But here, in this humble space filled with the scent of crayons and the sound of a child's unrestrained laughter, he discovered true sanctuary. He was learning that strength wasn't found in a stock portfolio or a skyline of buildings bearing his name, but in the quiet, steady act of being present, of mending what was broken, starting with the man in the mirror. Life often presents us with paths that seem to lead only to ruin. Moments where a single wrong turn can feel like the end of the road. Elena's journey that stormy night felt like just such a moment, a broken-down car, a looming eviction, a final, crushing blow from a cruel world. Yet, what appeared to be a catastrophic detour was, in fact, the destination itself. The universe sometimes works in such mysterious ways, reminding us that what seems like a devastating delay is merely destiny clearing the right path for you. Her choice to stop, to act with a grace she seemingly couldn't afford, didn't just save a man's life. It saved her own sire, proving that the most powerful currency we possess isn't money or influence, but the unwavering courage of a compassionate heart. The story of Elena and Marcus is not just a tale of two souls finding redemption on a forgotten road. It is a quiet testament to the profound power we all hold within us. It's a reminder that beneath the surface of every stranger, there is a story of pain, of loss, and of a deep-seated need for connection. We are constantly given choices, to look away or to lean in, to build walls or to open doors. The smallest act of kindness can be the one thing that holds a person's crumbling world together for one more day. If this story of forgiveness and second chances has touched your heart, consider sharing it with someone who might need to be reminded of the light. In doing so, you become part of the story, passing on the simple yet powerful truth that empathy is never wasted. As evening settled, casting a soft lavender glow across the city, the three of them stood by the window, looking out not at a world of threats, but one of possibilities. Leo stood between them, his small hands held securely in theirs. Marcus looked at Eleanor, his eyes, once haunted by ghosts, now filled with a profound and steady gratitude that was more eloquent than any words. She met his gaze and smiled, a look of pure, unburdened peace. There were no more secrets, no more fears, only the quiet, unbreakable bond of three people who had found their way home in the most unexpected of places. For an act of grace, offered without expectation, can rebuild a world that cruelty tried to tear down, creating a foundation strong enough to last a lifetime, bathed in the gentle light of a new day.